Joining us now, we have Amory Gethin. He is a researcher who has been doing incredible work. He's a visiting fellow at Harvard and also co-founder of World Political Cleavages and Inequality Database. Great to see you, Amory. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you, man.
Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. So we've been following the work you've been doing really closely. Some of you out there may have been as well. You guys have been digging into these education and income divides that we've seen here in America, but you're also seeing in a lot of countries in developed world democracies, where effectively people who are high income are still voting a lot of times for right-leaning parties, but people who are high education are now oftentimes voting for left-leaning parties. We can throw the latest paper that you all just published up there on the screen. The title here is Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, Changing Political Cleavages in 21 Western Democracies Between 1948 and 2020. The dynamic that you point to is basically, both sides of the political spectrum being controlled by different sets of elites and people with lower educational levels concentrating more and more on the right side of the political spectrum. Just dig into some of the data and what you found.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of this paper and more generally of this project that we have, which has become a book project, was to understand how voting behavior by education, income, but also by religion, age has changed over the long run. And put simply, in Western democracies, what we find is that there has been a striking divergence between these two dimensions of inequality that are education and income. In the 1950s and 60s, social democratic and affiliated parties, so including the Democratic Party in the US, used to be supported very strongly by low-income and lower-educated voters, while conservative parties used to gather more support from high-income and higher-educated voters. And in the past 50, 60 years, income does continue to determine high support for right-wing parties in general. Meanwhile, the effect of education has completely reversed. The educational divide has followed a striking reversal. And today, higher educated voters are much more likely to vote for the left. And so this leads to a separation between what we propose to call a Brahmin left, a sort of intellectual elite educated left, and a sort of still high-income merchant right.
And so, Amory, let's go ahead and put your tweet up there on the screen. I want to see that chart because it's very important for where exactly the change happened. Can you explain why the percentage points of the difference of the percent of the top 10% in educated voting left and the percent of the bottom 90% switched in 1991 to 1995? What exactly happened there across all of the West?
I think this chart shows not that something specific happened in the 80s or 90s, but it shows precisely that this has been a very long run, gradual process. So as you can see from the red line, for instance, the gap in left votes between higher and lower educated voters used to be minus 16. And so which means that lower educated voters were more likely to vote for left-wing parties by 16 percentage points. And this has just very gradually become less and less negative and then it turned positive in the 2000s. But it's really the outcome of a long-run gradual process. And there are variations across countries in the intensity of this reversal, but also on the level of the educational divide today, depending on how strong were class divides in the 50s. For instance, in Nordic countries such as Sweden, where class divides used to be very, very strong, well, this reversal does not seem to have completely happened today. It may happen in the coming elections or decades, while in countries, for instance, like the Netherlands, where it started to some extent earlier, well, it's been now a few decades that higher educated voters vote more for social democratic and affiliated parties. So this is really about a very gradual long run process, which I think goes beyond specific contextual factors or crises or any specific event.
Let's talk about the exceptions, because there are a couple of exceptions that stand out among all of these Western democracies that haven't followed the same trends. And effectively, just to make this simple for people, what you're pointing to here is a collapse of any sort of class politics, right? You have two two sides of the political spectrum effectively dominated by elites. Working class voters, at least in the US, kind of spread across both of the parties. So control of the parties effectively is happening at the elite level, and you have very little in terms of class politics, which ultimately leads to very little if you're interested in policies that lead to economic redistribution. But there are a couple of countries that have bucked the trend. Tell us what those countries are and why you think that they've not gone in the same direction as the rest of the Western democracies.
So there are two main countries that we identify as not following this trend, broadly speaking, and these are Portugal and Ireland. These two countries have quite specific histories. I mean, in Portugal, democracy only came back in the 1980s. And Ireland also has quite a specific history because it never really had any strong social democratic party or any kind of strong left-wing party at all. But in Ireland, since the 2008 crisis in particular, there's been the rise of Sinn Féin, which is considered to be more social democratic and left-wing. And in Portugal, especially since the crisis too, there's been a sort of rise of socioeconomic divides and redistribution and economic issues continue to play a very important role in comparison to other countries in the West. So in these two countries, we do observe the persistence of socioeconomic divides and the persistence or even rise of, to some extent, class divides today. On the fact that class politics have disappeared or declined, I think we should nuance this a bit too. It's not so much that they have disappeared, it's just that they have complexified tremendously. Mm-hmm. When we say that higher educated voters vote for different parties than high income voters, education and income are to some extent two dimensions of social class. And what we observe in many Western European countries today, where the party system is increasingly fragmented, is a sort of a split between voters depending on education or income. Typically, far-right parties tend to capture more votes from lower-educated voters, but not necessarily from low-income or high-income voters, while Green parties tend to be supported mainly by higher-educated voters, to some extent independently from income. And so we have this fragmentation of the political space, which leads to a sort of clustering of parties depending on these two dimensions of class, which are education and income.
So, Amory, let me ask you this. Which countries are the leading indicators? There's a common phenomenon in your home country, in France, in order to say we want to stop the exportation of Western-style controversy, wokeism, and all of that to our country, and those types of political phenomena. So you look at Western democracies as a whole. Is the United States the place where this happens and then it's exported out to the rest of the West? Or is it a different, more interesting picture happening?
No, I don't think the US is the leading example. This trend really happens in almost all Western democracies, and what distinguishes them most is perhaps where they started from. As I mentioned before, Sweden was very, very strongly class-based in the 50s, for instance, which means that this process has not completely been done today. I'd say that the two countries that perhaps were the earliest in finishing this transition are Switzerland and the Netherlands. Switzerland today is really in Europe the country where educational divides are the highest, and this is directly linked to the fact that Switzerland has the largest far-right party, anti-immigration party in Europe. And it also has, to some extent, the biggest green environmentalist bloc in Europe. So these kind of socio-cultural divides, this cultural dimension of political conflict, plays a particularly salient role in Switzerland. The US is, I'd say, too, one of the countries where it does and where it is the highest today among the West.
Is it fair to say that the more a country focuses on what we'll call sort of culture war clashes, the more rapidly you see this sorting out? Because that seems to be one of the things you indicate in your research, is that as these culture war issues take more and more prominence and become the more salient dividing lines between the sides of the spectrum, that's where you see the fragmentation of the class-based politics. That's where you see economic redistribution become less and less likely, and economics really to be not so much the focus of the political battles that are being waged. That's something certainly our audience would grasp and understand based on what we've seen here in the U.S. Is that a trend that, first of all, is that what you found? And second of all, does that apply to a lot of countries across the world?
So I'd say yes. So what we show in this article is that when you look at what parties propose and the kinds of issues that they emphasize, well, sociocultural issue emphasis is strongly linked to support for this party in terms of education. Put simpler, it means that when parties start dividing much more on sociocultural issues, then educational divides are likely to rise. At the same time, I think it's important to nuance a bit and to remember that the rise of these issues is perhaps not deterministic, and is also linked to the decline of the class politics of the 50s and 60s, and so the decline of ambitious proposals also in terms of redistributive economic policies, and the loss of confidence that many working class voters had in the 50s and 60s for social democratic parties. The decline in confidence for these parties has arguably contributed to the rise of this new dimension of political conflict.
Wow.
And finally, this may be, you may not want to speculate on this, but it seems like these trends really begin in the 60s. And of course, the 60s in America and around, a lot of places very tumultuous, a lot of emphasis on, shaking free the cultures of the past, moving in a different direction. I mean, is it an accident, do you think, that this starts and continues from the 60s?
Yes and no. I mean, arguably the 60s played a catalyzing role in accelerating this transition, just like I think that the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s played a role in accelerating this transition. Perhaps the 2008 crisis or globalization, all these various factors, I think, played a role in this transition. But the few countries where we have data, even before the 60s, seem to show a trend towards a reversal of educational divides that starts earlier than the 60s. So I do think it's a longer run process that also goes beyond these specific movements, these specific turning points, which are important, but I think are only part of the story.
Got it.
Fascinating stuff. I know you're working on a book also that is set to come out here shortly. We're excited to take a look at that as well. Amory Gethin, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this all down for us.
Thanks, Amory. We'll have links to all this stuff in the description. Really appreciate you joining us, man.
Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for watching. It's been amazing. This is our official 6 months since we started, Krystal. Can you believe it? I actually can't. It's completely and totally wild.
Kind of like forever, and also kind of like it happened in an instant.
I swear we were designing this desk just yesterday. But look at it.
Your baby is growing up.
It's pelled up pretty well. Not a lot of scratches. We got these nice pads and everything. In all seriousness, you guys have blown us away. We are already in discussions. I mean, we've upgraded here the studio. We actually have new audio equipment and more, so we can have more people here at the desk in the future. We are building and preparing for the big election cycle for the midterms, bringing more people, seeing how we can best leverage our show, our resources, all of that. We can only do it with your support, so the premium link is down there in the description. You're helping us grow. We're literally just getting started. It's been an amazing journey. I really can't believe that number one or top 5 politics and we never dropped below number 5 in the Spotify politics one.
Wow.
650 something thousand subscribers on YouTube. I put this out yesterday. We've been viewed 100 million times on YouTube, which boggles the mind.
It's crazy.
I can't even believe it's real. Really, and to have the 6-month period. So it's all credit to you. For those who signed up, thank you. For those who can't support us, it really means the world.
Yeah, we love you guys. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic weekend. We're going to have some great content for you, including our partnership with the Daily Poster and some other segments that we've got in the can that I think you'll enjoy. So have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you back here next week.
See you next week.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.